Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Annalie Legault, and I'm an Employment and Labour Partner in Denton's Toronto office. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 10th weekly Friday webinar, providing legal updates on COVID-19 related workplace issues. On today's webinar, we'll be doing something new. As Canada slowly reopens, we have arranged for a panel of our colleagues from Europe to provide guidance and tips based on their reopening experiences. We'll be hearing from Catel Danielle Ayou from Paris. She is the global chair of our employment and labor practice. Isabelle Poul from Berlin, and Davide Boffi from Milan. Davide is the head of the Italian employment and labor practice. After we hear from Europe, we will have some time to hear from colleagues in Canada on Canadian issues. Karina Polipchik from Toronto, Adrian Elmsley and Christina Wendell from Edmonton will be answering questions after the European session. Now, for accreditation purposes, as you probably all know from previous webinars, this session is eligible for 1 substantive hour with the Law Society of Ontario and the Law Society of British Columbia. We've also submitted an application for eligibility to the Barreau du Québec, which is pending. An email will be sent to all registrants on Monday with the recording from today. And just a reminder, we have created an insights page on our dentons.com website that has all of the employment and labor webinar series recordings and materials. As usual, you can submit your questions in the chat window, and we'll do our best to answer them today or next Friday. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Catel, Isabelle, and Davide to answer some questions about their experiences in Europe. Davide, what types of businesses, in your experience, have had the greatest challenges, the most difficulties in reopening?
Hello everyone, and thank you, Annalie, for give me the opportunity to join this very interesting panel. Well, I would say that all the businesses in sectors in Italy have been affected by the emergency crisis, and therefore the challenges in reopening are interesting all the types of businesses. As you probably know, Italy was the first and most affected country in Europe with regard to the COVID-19 outbreak. However, since the beginning of the lockdown, the Italian government has decided to totally block some activities and, on the other hand, to allow some other sectors to continue to operate. For example, companies operating the food production in the pharmaceutical sector and in the IT and electronic devices sector never stopped, or stopped with very limited with some limitation, let's say. Now, from the 4th of May, the so-called second phase started, and the main part of the businesses' activities gradually reopened, but they must comply with very strong rules related to the health and safety of the employees in order to reopen. In particular, pursuant to the latest governmental decrees, the gradual return to working activity must take place in complete safety, with employers following the provisions of the public and the health authorities. The measures provided, for example, include workspaces with fixed quotas for people working in the workplace, rotation and shifts to reduce gatherings, minimum stay permitted in common areas, and no training allowed other than e-learning. There is a global prohibition in travel, both in Italy and abroad, and so it is very difficult to say that reopening will be something that can be managed in an easy way in Italy.
Okay, thank you, Davide. Catel, I know we have some clothing retailers on the seminar today, and I know we all want to go out to buy some clothes from clothing retailers. How are the clothing retailers in Europe, or at least in France, dealing with issues like face coverings and gloves, going to a change room to try on clothing? Like, are you allowed to try on clothing? What if someone wants to return clothing to the store that they've changed their mind about? What is happening on that in that area?
Yes, good morning, everybody. effectively, you are right. For retailers, clothing retailers, it's a very difficult challenge. In France, normally as from last Monday, all the retailers, of clothing retailers could open, except for the biggest one, the department stores of more than 40,000 square meters. They need a special authorization from the authority. So typically in Paris, for those who knows, Printemps, Galeries Lafayette are closed, BHV, Bon Marché are open. But why? Because the government has published a sort of guidelines on the rules you have to implement it in your retail, in your shops. And I think the main issue for the big one is they have unions, so they have to negotiate a sort of protocol to how to circulate in the retailers' shops. And so that's why I assume that Galeries Lafayette and Printemps did not have yet the authorization, but it will come. For the small shop, the main issue is that you have to implement protection, what they call collective protection, which means that when you have a small shop, at the end of the day, sometimes you could only have one client per one client. And because, you know, to comply with this limit that you have also in Canada of 1 meter around you, so in small premises, sometimes you could have 1 or 2 people. What we have seen is all the retailers provide masks or ask for masks, which is not mandatory by law, but they ask clients to have masks, and if they don't have one, usually it is the owner of the shop who provides the mask to the clients. Concerning the change rooms, again, to comply with this distanciation limit, when you have several changing rooms, usually you have to close among 2 of them another one, just to be sure that the client will not be in deep contact. And of course, all these measures is for the client, and for the people working in the shop, you also have some protection, notably when you have to buy staff. And so that's why we have seen retailers who really recommend to people to pay by credit card, which I think is already a main trend, but it's really recommended. And we have even seen, I don't know if you have the same in Canada, but we have even seen the banks who have increased the selling of up to which you could pay only by, you know, contact without the PIN code that we have normally to do. And so until 50 euro, you could pay without any contact. Again, just to limit the contact, to protect people working in the shop and to protect clients.
Thank you. That's interesting. Isabel, how are the employers in Germany who deal with members of the public, such as stores, how are they dealing with scheduling their own employees who belong to a higher risk group? And maybe you could first tell us what kind of higher risk groups there are, and then what employers are doing with those employees.
Thank you, Annalie, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, the risk groups are a really big issue in Germany, and they are defined as generally people above the age of 60, people with pulmonary diseases, and also people with any heart diseases or special risks in this regard, because they're considered to be more likely to have a very serious progress of COVID-19. So there are no laws so far on how to deal with them, but there are recommendations from both the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor Affairs, and also some of the occupational health insurances. And those really strongly recommend that employees belonging to such higher risk groups should not be having contact with the public. So, for example, in retail stores, they shouldn't be at the cashier or answering questions to clients, but that they should rather for example, be working in a warehouse, and where this is not wanted or possible, they should be provided with protective measures such as, for example, face masks.
Great, thank you. Are pregnant employees considered to be in a high-risk group, Isabel?
So far not. It seems that's at least what the scientists in Germany say, that they're not at a really high risk so far, but I am pretty sure, and that's what I've heard from clients, that they are basically treating them as a high-risk group because, I mean, no one wants to take any risk in this respect, of course.
All right, thank you. Catel, now that Canada's starting to reopen, we're wondering, are you finding that employees have been afraid to come to work? Are they reluctant? Are they worried about taking the metro or the bus or something? What's happening? What are you seeing?
So we see two things. The first one is effectively in the big city like Paris, people are really afraid to take public transportation for two reasons. First, because effectively, even we all know that there is a lot of people in public transportation, and public transportation have the same issue that all the employers. They have people who are ill, on sick leave, who have to take care of kids. So they are not able, at least when we first start to reopen the line, they were not able to be at 100% of the traffic. So that's why the government really incitates employers to continue to have people who could working remotely. And what we have seen, notably in Paris, our mayor has facilitate access by bike. And when we test our employees, they all say that they will try to effectively, if they could not work remotely, to come by bicycle, by foot. But that's effectively the main concern, even if I think it functions well, and the mask is mandatory in the public transportation. So by law, it's the sole place where it is mandatory. And I think, for instance, it functions quite well. I've just seen that we have on the chat one question from, I think, O.C. Newman concerning employers, if they could force employees to come with a mask. In fact, at least for France, it is the employer who is responsible at work on the safety of the people, and it is the employer who has to provide masks to employees. But the government, the city, distribute a lot of masks, even public transportation for free. You could easily have access to masks.
Okay, great, thank you. Davide, I'm not sure if you've had this experience yourself, but how should an employer deal with a workplace where one of their employees has tested positive for COVID-19? So you know for sure that one of your workers has COVID-19. What does an employer have to do then?
Well, unfortunately, we already had this kind of experience. Several clients had this kind of issue to manage. The very important point under an Italian perspective is that from the very beginning of the outbreak, the trade unions organizations and the entrepreneurs organizations decided to draft a protocol for health and safety. And it is very important because the government, after 2 weeks, has taken this protocol and enforced it. So it make it as with an enforcement of law. He take it, and the same content was drafted and inserted into a decree. So it became a piece of law, and now is regulating all the procedures and the policies to be taken into account within the workplaces. And it is very good because it is drafted by the entrepreneurs and the companies, so it's very practical. For example, with regard to the management of someone that is found positive, first of all, it must be mentioned that all the employees do check the body temperatures of the employees before entering into the company's premises. This is not mandatory, but is strongly recommended by the government, and therefore all the companies, also the small-sized companies, are used to follow this general rule. And according to the protocol, as soon as an employee is aware of having a temperature of more than 37.5 degrees, the employee must be immediately isolated in a specific area of the company. And then the employee must contact his personal doctor to manage the issue. Moreover, in the case of employee that is tested, it must stay at home, and he may be quarantined for a period of 14 days, that is extended to 28 days in Lombardy. You know, Lombardy is the most important region in Italy, where Milan is placed, and the economic heart of the country, and also the place where the most important outbreak was faced in Italy. So in this case, the government of the region decided to double the period of quarantine. So as soon as one employee is affected by the COVID-19, it must stay 28 days at home, and he can come back to work only subject to a serological test in order to avoid all the risk of contagion within their workplace.
Davide, I know you have strict privacy laws in Europe. One thing Canadian employers are asking us a lot is if one employee tested positive, are you as an employer allowed to tell the other employees who it was, or are you not allowed to tell the other employees who it was, like their actual name? What's the rule there?
This is very interesting. I can explain what happens in Italy. I don't know if my colleagues are in the same situation. It is very interesting because from the very beginning, the GDPR implications were sacrificed, and in the balance between the health and safety and the GDPR, the health and safety won. This means that, for example, according to the protocol that I mentioned before, not only the employee can check the body temperature, that under Italian law is one of the sensitive elements from a GDPR standpoint, but he is also obliged to make all the other employees aware of this fact in order to let them testing themselves in order to avoid any kind of contagion. So the rules related to privacy in Italy are very sacrificed now in order to avoid at all the risk of contagion.
Oh, Catel, is it the same situation in France? Can an employer tell the name of someone who's tested positive to the other employees?
No, I think it's a little bit more hypocrite, if I could say. You are not supposed to give the name of the person who has been recognized as positive, but you must inform his colleague or her colleague that they have been in contact with someone who has been recognized positive. So the employer has to take some measures and to either send them to we have, occupational doctors who are in charge of reviewing the health and safety at work. So you have to take measures, but you are not supposed to give the name.
What is it in Germany? Sorry.
No problem.
It's very similar to Catel, actually, or to France. I think what's interesting in Germany is that all COVID-19 infections need to be reported to the competent health authority, and the person then also needs to give information about its employer, and the employer would then be notified even by the authority. So at the end of the day, sort of the employee needs to be transparent about an infection, and it's the same thing here that employers would then need to find out who has been in contact with that person. But again, you shouldn't make a public announcement in the company saying XYZ is now infected with COVID-19. But in practice, I mean, it spreads very quickly. We all know that. Well,
that's what I figured. I figured every employee will know after a while, even if you don't tell them. Now, Davide mentioned that in Italy, employers are taking temperatures of employees as they come to work. Is that the same situation in Germany, Isabel?
Some companies do, some of our clients, especially in sort of manufacturing sites who cannot really keep the 1.50 meter distance, do it. But it's nothing that is generally recommended as it is in Italy. And if there should be a works council, there's no mandatory works councils in Germany. This is definitely a measure of co-determination of the works council.
What about,
and then, of course, you would need to be very clear about how long the information can be stored, etc.
Right. We have that concern here, too, in Canada, and not used for any other purpose. Catel, in France, are employers taking temperatures as people come to work?
No, I think we are exactly the same approach that in Germany. What was interesting is that before having some government guidelines, a lot of employers asking us if they have to take temperatures, if it was mandatory. And the government was very clear. You have no obligation, and it's even not recommended. Why? For a simple reason. If effectively, we know temperature is one of the indications that you could be infected, but it's better that you take your own temperature when you are at home, before taking transportation, before arriving in the company. So that's why they consider that it's not appropriate measures to take temperature at work, because it may be already late and you may have already contaminated people during the travel between your home and the work. That being said, we have some clients in manufacturing activities effectively who take temperatures because it's more because people are really a little bit afraid to be effectively without the distance with the colleagues when they work in shift. So that's why some clients did it. But it's more to reinsure people, and I think it's not a real protection measure.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sometimes it's the coworkers who want other people to have their temperature taken.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now let's talk a little bit about face coverings and face masks. Catel told us about face masks being given out and employers being required to give them out and not requiring employees to bring their own in France. Davide, are employers giving out face masks at the workplace and in Italy? And if so, is it at every kind of workplace or just some workplaces? What's the thought on face masks?
Well, with regard to the face mask, again, Italy is particularly focused on protecting employees, so it is mandatory. According to the latest decree, any kind of employer must provide all the employees with masks, with face masks, and the employee cannot start working without a mask. So it's mandatory and cannot be refused by the employee to wear the mask.
Have any employees tried to refuse? Like, do they have any valid reasons for refusing to wear a face mask?
Absolutely no, and this is one of the most tricky point because there are some business sectors in which there are some concerns about the employees with regard to having the masks, but again, the protocol for the health and safety clearly states that any kind of business and most of all any kind of employer, so also little size employers, so also restaurants, pubs and so on, must provide the employees with masks, and no one can avoid that.
Okay, and Isabel, in Germany, are employers giving out masks? Do employees want masks? Is it mandatory?
Really depends on the type of business that we're talking about. So in retail, it's not mandatory. Also, people entering retail stores have to wear a simple mask. And the general rule under German law is wherever there is a safety measure that has to be taken in the establishment, it needs to be paid, basically, or provided by the company and not the employee. What is happening now is that the official recommendations, there's no binding law on that, but the recommendations by, for example, the occupational health insurances say where you're not sure to keep the 1.50 meter safety distance, you should work with masks. So for example, in manufacturing businesses where it's just simply not possible to keep the distance.
Right, okay, so it's not one rule for every place. Okay, so let's talk about that physical distancing, because I think that's going to be very challenging for some of our clients. I'll start with you, Isabel. It sounds like in Germany it's a 1.5 meter rule that applies in the workplace. In Canada it's 2 meters. What kind of issues or challenges have employers had in trying to maintain distancing in a workplace, and has it been expensive for them? Have there been costs?
Well, for example, if you're looking at companies that are using offices, I mean, most of them, they don't have office spaces that are designed to keep these distances. So what is happening now really is that they still need to assign some employees who work from home. And of course, well, for some employees, that's very efficient. For others, it's not so much. Then they've really started to implement simple measures like using arrows on the floors to show like one direction pathways and things like that. Like very simple measures, but it seems quite effective. I mean, time is still not. It's still quite a new situation. So it's not really the time now that companies have already started building up new measures. In retail stores, you see that they've constructed sort of shields for the cashier, for example, with like plastic or plexiglass panes protecting employees, but all of those look quite do-it-yourself. But of course, the face masks are quite an issue now, because if you want to provide the real protective face masks, they are much more expensive than the normal ones. I think it's really a big process of navigating through it, but there are also risks of punitive fines, liability, if you do not provide necessary protection.
Right, and Davide, what have you seen in Italy that employers have experienced in trying to do the physical distancing in the workplace? And it sounds like from what Isabel said, it doesn't really cost any money exactly to do it. Some of it can be very simple. What are you seeing in Italy on physical distancing in a workplace?
Well, again, also in this case, Italy is different than the other countries because, for example, the distance is of 1 meter so far. All the governmental decrees stated 1 meter, that is the minimum distance. I have to say that tonight the Prime Minister said that he will have a new speech. We are facing 2 times a week a new speech of our Prime Minister because we have emergency rules changing, and probably tonight he will introduce the 2 meters rule. Anyway, with regard to the distance, one of the most important and critical points for Italian employers is related to managing, in particular, the manufacturing functions, because in the manufacturing plants it is very difficult to comply with a distance of 1 meter or 2 meters, in particular in the production lines. The way that the employers are trying to reach is to improve the gloves, mask, all the instruments that can be used in order to contain and to limit the contagion, because there is a specific rule stating that in some cases the rule related to the distance can be avoided if the employer can guarantee the introduction of all the elements in order to protect the employees. This is very costly because all the companies, in particular, for example, in the canteens, if you have a plant and you have people eating, you have to build some physical distancing items, and also you have to organize shifts in order to have people eating or having the break during the working time. So it's very costly, and this is why in Italy the companies, if they can, opt to have people working remotely at home in order to avoid to have too much people within the plant.
Thank you. So it can cost a lot of money depending. It looks like it costs more for manufacturers. Catel, what about your experience in physical distancing in any types of different businesses in France? What have you seen of interest or that would be helpful?
I think that all employers, whatever the activity is, retailers, manufacturers, they say that it's very costly and that will impact their productivity. Because in shops, if you could only have one or two clients per one or two clients, people will not wait hours to buy stuff. And to reorganize all the circulation in your shop is also needs time, needs costs. And that's why we have the government mentioned that they will support the cost, part of it, up to 50% of the cost for the company having less than 50 employees within the limit of 5,000 euro. And like in Germany, like in Italy, for clients who have consultancy activity, insurers, etc., they don't have sufficient space to have everybody, so that's why effectively they have no choice than to keep people working remotely. So based on survey done over the past days, it appears that company was able to, or were able for, like in La Défense, you know, in big tower, they have between 10 and 25% of their people on site, which is not a lot. And in the manufacturing activities, the real issue is effectively sometimes you just could work on one line because there is no distance between, or not sufficient distance between people. So that's why unions request more cleaning, and that's the limit of the exercise, because cleaning, for example, manufacturing, when you're manufacturing cars, if you have to stop the line to clean the product to arrive, then you have an impact on your productivity. So I think for all employers, that will represent a cost. So effectively probably more complex when you have more people, but it's a cost obviously, because it's really a nightmare to be able to comply with all these rules to preserve as much as possible all these distance rules.
Oh, wow, thank you. Yeah, I think Canada's going to start experiencing that soon. Isabel, have you had government inspectors coming in? Is that how it's done in Germany? And have they been shutting down any workplaces, or what are they looking for when they come in?
Yeah, we've had the first cases and also the first court judgments. Last week, for example, there was a meat manufacturer in the western part of Germany that was shut down because about a quarter of its employees were tested positive. And at the time of the shutdown, I think still around 250 results were outstanding. And then the health authority acted pretty quickly, and the company filed a complaint at the administrative court, and that was declined, saying the basic standards of hygiene and social distancing were not obeyed to, both in the actual site, like where the meat is cut. It's just what Catel said, that it's basically, I mean, it's one line, and people stand by pretty quickly, and so it was, for example, detected that the people weren't using their face masks properly, and that's also what you see a lot here when you go to retail shops, for example. And then the second big issue was apparently the changing rooms, and there the social distancing wasn't kept at all. And I mean, this company is now shut down, and the administrative court made it very clear that financial issues alone are no valid argument here to make any compromises about the health of employees and their contact persons. So I think this will really be the line of case law here. So companies should invest now and investigate to see what measures specifically for their type of business there are to be taken.
Thank you very much. Catel, are your employer clients seeing new or different or more employee mental health issues now?
Yes, I think that's a really key, I would say not new issue, but yes, because we realize, and I think it's in all the sectors, that to work from home, and we never know in which condition they live, was very difficult for people not to have any more a relation with colleagues. And there is an article today in Les Echos, with a famous newspaper, and they say that even for the employers, they have made a survey, and they consider that more than 20% of the top managers that they have some potentially health issue because they are not used not to be active. They are, of course, under the pressure of the future of the company. So the government create a sort of green line to have specialists over the phone, just to, you know, like we did for psychological issue, sexual harassment in the workplace. So it's really an issue, and not only, of course, for employees, but also for employers. And for employees, we have seen more and more employers who reinforce their assistance on the what we call psychological risk, knowing that under French law, any employer, whatever your activity is supposed to identify all the risk you have in your industry, to adapt the premises, to adapt the tools, materials, etc. And in the context of the possibility to come back to work, in the context of the COVID, which is still there, what we have seen is that most of our clients integrate in this statement also specific protection or specific measures to assist employees on the psychological issues, to help them to recover, if I could, when they come back to work. And also, despite the risk, a lot of people want to come back to work because of this issue they have to face when they are alone at home.
Davide, are you seeing the same types of issues that employers are addressing in Italy in terms of mental health?
Well, yes, it's completely the same in Italy as in France. I have to say that what we can see is that there are some categories of employees that wish to come back to work. Other categories that are working very well with regard to the remote working. We have a law, so-called smart working law, that is related to the remote working. It is important to understand that before COVID-19 outbreak, the use of this kind of law referred to the 3% of the working population in Italy. After the outbreak, according to the latest data that we had last week, the 97% of people working in Italy is working remotely. So there is a huge debate under Italian law within the parliament, but also among the authors with regard to employment law, with regard to the use and how to implement in an ordinary way these remote working. So people are asking to come back to work, but on the other hand, some categories of employees, in particular the administrative sector, the finance sectors, the HR sector, would like to improve and increase the remote working in an ordinary way.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you all one last question. Catel, what for you has been the biggest surprise in terms of returning to work?
I think it's probably the anxiety of people who are really afraid to come back to work, and but in the meantime, so they prefer to stay home, but in the meantime they are able to go to do shopping. So, you know, it's for a category of people, I think, also appreciate, to be clear, to stay home, and are effectively afraid and to come back to work. And in this case, what is complex is how to find the good way, the good approach in the place of work to answer to this anxiety, which is not always very, I would say, reasonable, even if we know that it's a very terrible disease. But so it's effectively sometimes not really a rational position of employees who don't want to take any risk at work, but who are able to take risk in their private lives.
They can't come to work, but they can go shopping. Okay.
Exactly.
Isabel, what's been your biggest surprise?
I think it's part of what Catel said, but in Germany, I now have the feeling that people are quite eager actually to go back to their offices. Like they are not so happy with working at home anymore. And then new issues arise, like who can work back in office at what time. Like we're making sort of a shift system in some offices now, so that you can actually obey to the social distancing rules. And another matter is, and that's what we see also in families with friends, who really obeys to the rules, how strictly. So we have complaints from employees about other employees who are not really keeping the distance. So there are really a lot of new issues coming up, and it will really be a totally new working environment that we need to be living with for the next months.
Thank you. And what about you, Davide? What's your biggest surprise?
Well, the biggest surprise is the sense of freedom that people has during the last week. As you probably know, Italy was the most affected and also the country with the longest period of lockdown. People passed 2 months, more than 2 months at home without any chance to go out. Not only for work, but also for everything. And you know, Italians are people quite friendly, so we passed Easter and other bank holidays at home without having the chance to meet our parents and so on. So during this week, I have to say, we see a sense of freedom also of the employees that want to come, want to go out from their homes, and they are clearly managing the issues in a proper way. This is another surprise for us, to see how Italian employers faced the emergency that was a nightmare, as Catel said before, in a way very polite, and you know, for Italians it's quite a surprise.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Catel and Isabel and Davide. We appreciate you taking time on what is a Friday evening for you to join us. And now we'll turn to some Canadian questions. Adrienne Elmsley, how can an employer mitigate the risks associated with deciding which employees return to the work site and which ones work from home?
Thanks, Emily. There's a couple of things to keep in mind here. You want to sort of take a bit of a practical approach to it. And so the first thing an employer should be doing is they should be looking at who actually needs to be there and who can continue to work from home. I think, you know, if you start with that practical approach, and if the employee doesn't need to physically be at the work site to perform their job and they've been working remotely successfully, then really the division as to who should come in and who shouldn't should be sort of drawn on those lines. So to start with, I think only the people that have to be there should be there. I think that's sort of the responsible approach, and that's probably the one that's going to cause you the least hassle with your employees and get the least amount of sort of blowback, so to speak. The other thing, though, that you have to look at is you have to look at whether there are employees that have actual restrictions. So those would be employees that have that are particularly vulnerable if they catch COVID, or employees who have child care needs or needs related to what's going on. And the reason you want to look at those, if there are people that you want to bring back into the workforce but they're resistant or they have those issues, you have to take a look at those because they can trigger statutory obligations either by way of a protected leave that has been recognized by most of the provinces, or in each province they'll have different protected leaves, but I believe just about every province has a specific leave related to COVID, and a lot of those times those relate to child care obligations that the employee has to look after, and so the employer has to be aware that they may not be able to require that employee to return to work, and they still have to protect their job. The other sort of statutory requirement that you would have would be human rights considerations. And that might be with respect to a particularly vulnerable employee, or even an employee that has some other form of disability like severe anxiety about returning to the workforce. So again, for those employees, you have to take a look at the reason why they're not coming in, and then you have to do an assessment as to whether it triggers either a statutory leave obligation or a human rights obligation, which would result in either an accommodation or a determination that you're dealing with a bona fide occupational requirement and accommodation isn't needed. But those are the things you'd have to look at if you're looking to mitigate your risks about deciding who comes back to the office and who doesn't.
Great, thank you very much. Christina, people are starting to turn their minds to workers' comp. If an employee is tested positive for COVID-19, but it's not really clear how they got the virus, does it still have to be reported to workers' compensation by the employer?
Thanks, Annalie. So the specific WCB reporting requirements will vary from province to province. With COVID-19, typically the big concern or the issue is that it's difficult to know where the employee contracted it. In order to be a WCB matter, of course, there has to be a sufficient employment nexus. So the question with COVID-19 claims is whether the employment causes a greater risk of exposure for the worker. In Alberta specifically, the WCB here has put out a fact sheet that discusses the COVID-19 reporting requirements. And according to that fact sheet, an employer is required to report a case of COVID-19 in a worker to WCB if it's work-related. And then it sets out the test for when it's work-related. And that has a couple of requirements. The first is that the nature of the employment involves sufficient exposure to the source of infection. And then the second piece is that the nature of employment either A, is shown to be the cause of the condition, or B, the nature of the employment creates a greater risk of exposure for the worker. So in the fact sheet, it notes that WCB claims are likely to be accepted if a worker contracts the illness and is performing what has been deemed to be an essential service that puts them in regular contact with the general public. So with all things COVID-19 related, this has been a bit of a fluid issue, and this particular comment is a bit of a shift for those who may have seen the previous version of the fact sheet, where they actually used an acute health worker as an example where reporting would be required, but a grocery store clerk as an example of where it would not be required. Based on this current fact sheet, I don't think it's fair to say that the grocery store clerk would not be a reportable claim at this point. So I do think employers in that situation would be required to report it. There's also a requirement to report where the case of COVID is related to an outbreak at the workplace. So the fact sheet notes that employees will be entitled to coverage if it's involved in an outbreak. So while the WCB doesn't typically consider COVID-19 to be an occupational illness, it has now a second fact sheet that they just recently released earlier this week, notes that COVID-19 may become an occupational hazard. So from the WCB Alberta's perspective, where there's multiple workers in a workplace who have tested positive for COVID, then that means that there may then be a greater risk to the workers in that workplace than to the general public. That then will trigger the reporting requirement so that WCB, it doesn't mean that the claim is going to be accepted, but it will trigger the reporting requirement so that WCB can then investigate the matter and determine if it should be a covered claim.
Great, thanks very much. Karina, another thing that employers are starting to wonder about is if they have to terminate employment, are employers going to be granted leniency by the courts in terms of the size of the severance claim because of the pandemic?
Thanks, Annalee. So, first I'll just quickly touch on statutory entitlements. So, an employee who's been terminated will be entitled to, in most provinces, statutory termination pay, and then in some provinces, statutory severance pay as well. Those entitlements are going to continue, so employers will be required to pay those regardless of the existence of the pandemic. With respect to common law entitlements or reasonable notice, as we often refer to it, this is something that is going to develop over time as cases actually get before the courts. We are already seeing that employee counsel or plaintiff's counsel are seeking longer notice periods on the basis that their clients will face greater difficulty in obtaining new employment in this pandemic job market. But on the flip side, many employers are in an unprecedented situation here in terms of downturn in business and finances. And so as a result of that, we would argue that the global pandemic and the corresponding downturn has significantly impacted the finances of companies and their ability to pay that reasonable notice, and that the court should be taking that into account. And so what we know from looking at past case law and how the courts have historically responded is that our courts do look at availability of alternate employment as a factor for determining the length of the reasonable notice period. Historically, however, the lack of employment opportunities has been a basis for increasing a notice period for an employee potentially, whereas courts have usually declined to consider economic conditions as a basis for decreasing the notice period. So essentially, historically, our courts have not treated that as a factor that would favor an employer. That being said, we know that this situation is unprecedented. It's not like any industry or even country-specific recession or economic conditions that we've seen before. And so, like I said, this is something that we'll certainly be arguing on behalf of employers, and that, if nothing more, the notice period should remain the same. There shouldn't be an increase into them. And so ultimately, we're just going to have to wait until the first few cases get before judges in the courts and see what the outcomes of those cases are and how the courts start leaning.
Great, thank you. So either really good news or really bad news coming up.
Basically, yeah.
Adrian, is there a duty of care on the part of an employer to report a confirmed positive COVID-19 case to the other employees at the workplace?
Well, Annalee, it's actually very, I was interested to hear the comments from our European colleagues because the rules here are very similar in that there is generally a requirement to advise employees if they have potentially been exposed to COVID. But like we heard from our colleagues, the naming of an actual individual or identifying an individual who has been diagnosed as COVID is not something that you would want to do. There are always privacy concerns, particularly in provinces that have specific privacy legislation like BC, Alberta, and Quebec, but also there's the federal requirements and general privacy requirements that would mitigate against an employer actually identifying the employee. The practical part of it is that of course, once you know that you've been exposed, there's a pretty good chance that they'll figure out who it is. But all in all, there is a duty, and usually you would be working with the local health authorities to identify the people who have been in contact and be warning them that way. And oftentimes the health authorities will do work with the employer to identify the employees that have been in contact and take the appropriate steps. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but in general, there's an obligation to with the guidance of health authorities to identify and notify employees that may have been exposed, but not to specifically identify who it was that might have exposed them to it.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. Christina, what if an employee is coming to work, they have a family member in their own household, in their own house, who is ill with COVID-19, but the employee doesn't have any symptoms, so they just keep coming to work and they don't tell the employer? Are there legal implications for the employee or for the employer?
Thanks. So yes, there would be a number of legal implications to the employee and potentially some to the employer as well. So, I mean, aside from the employment relationship and the matters that arise from that, the employee would be in violation of a public health order by their conduct. So in Alberta, we have an order from the Chief Medical Officer that specifically requires that close contacts of someone who is confirmed as having COVID-19 have to be in quarantine for a minimum of 14 days. So with a family member at home, obviously this employee is in breach of that order. Now there is an exemption for essential services workers, so depending on the context that may be an exemption, but that exemption is still limited. It has to be essential services workers designated by the employer as essential, and a medical officer has to have been satisfied that there's a low risk to public health by having the employee at work. So otherwise, the employee would be in breach of the public health order and would be subject to the enforcement measures such as fines. The employee is likely also in breach of their obligations under occupational health and safety legislation as a worker. So in the Alberta Act, for example, workers have a general duty to take reasonable care to protect the health and safety of others at the work site. So if you have an employee like this one disregarding the public health order and exposing his or her coworkers to COVID-19, then I think a good case can be made to show that the worker is in breach of that general obligation. So while it's not often that occupational health and safety pursues a worker alone, it's certainly possible. It could also expose the employer under occupational health and safety requirements, depending on what the employer has done to avoid the situation happening. So if it's shown that there was no screening measures in place or no proper screening measures, that could be problematic. Employers really do need to be making it clear to workers that they need to be following the public health orders and they shouldn't be attending work in circumstances where they should either be in quarantine or if they're experiencing symptoms. If that's not being done, or if there's either no screening or no proper screening in place, then that can expose the employer to an occupational health and safety prosecution as well, because they will then be in breach of the employer's general duty under the legislation to ensure the health and safety of its workers. Now, if the employer has proper procedures in place, the workers just disregarded and lied to the employer, then that could be grounds for discipline as well, or potentially even termination depending on the specific circumstances. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Okay, thank you to everyone for taking the time to join today's webinar. Our time is up. We hope you found this session to be informative, and thank you to all of the presenters. Attendees, if you have any questions for our speakers today, you can feel free to contact them directly, and we've provided them provided you with all their contact information on the slide deck. And as a reminder, we will make the recording available early next week. So next Friday, we'll have a webinar again at 12 o'clock Eastern. We're going to focus on Canadian return to work questions. I'm seeing a lot of questions come in on the chat box in terms of liability for remote work and for that home office. And we'll start to address all of those questions. So I wish all of you good health, to all of you and to your families. Thank you very much.